Hola, buenos días, buenas tardes. Una alegría reencontrarnos en las actividades de la Semana de los Idiomas. Mi nombre es Marcelo García, soy presidente de la Asociación de Centros de Idiomas, entidad argentina que organiza la Semana de los Idiomas desde hace 20 ediciones. Esta es la edición número 20 de la Semana de los Idiomas, y en este caso, desde el año pasado, la semana se ha virtualizado, podemos hacer actividades que son virtuales, históricamente ha sido una actividad siempre presencial, y esta virtualización de la semana nos ha permitido no solamente llegar a muchos más centros de Argentina, a muchas más instituciones, sino también tener colaboraciones con instituciones del exterior. Hoy, por ejemplo, acabamos de tener una actividad con el Museo de la Lengua Portuguesa de São Paulo, de Brasil, y así hemos tenido un montón de actividades con distintos referentes que tienen que ver con las lenguas y la cultura en distintas partes del mundo. Para mí es un honor, aparte, participar de esta actividad en especial, porque además de ser presidente de SEA, soy director general de Beckett Studio, y esta actividad está organizada por el equipo de Beckett, así que mis felicitaciones también para el equipo de Beckett Studio, y agradecer que se sumen a esta Semana de los Idiomas, donde hablamos de lengua y cultura para la inclusión y la diversidad. Estamos desde el 20 de septiembre con un montón de actividades, muchas de ellas son cerradas de los propios centros, en las propias clases, otras son abiertas a la comunidad, como es en este caso esta actividad que ofrece Beckett, y además hemos realizado intercambios entre estudiantes de distintos centros del país y también con estudiantes de otros países, como ayer hicimos entre el Instituto Cervantes de Brasil y los estudiantes de portugués como lengua extranjera de Argentina. Esta actividad de hoy es en inglés, hay actividades que son en muchos idiomas durante la Semana de los Idiomas, incluyendo lenguas originarias, incluyendo lengua de señas argentina, así que también para la asociación es una gran alegría poder mostrar la diversidad lingüística y poder mostrar también el trabajo que hacen los centros de idiomas en toda la Argentina durante todo el año. Así que bueno, le doy la bienvenida a Soledad Brizuela, que es la coordinadora académica de Beckett Studio, y Ashley. Bueno, Ashley fue profesora de Beckett, así que una alegría tenerla nuevamente, siempre tenemos un afecto muy especial por ella y por su paso por Argentina, pero bueno, ahora desde Estados Unidos, tejiendo estos puentes a través de esta maravillosa posibilidad que nos da un canal como es la tecnología. Así que bueno, Sole, te dejo el escenario para que presentes a nuestra invitada de honor y que ella pueda también ser parte de la Semana de los Idiomas, donde hablamos de inclusión y donde hablamos de diversidad. Así que bueno, gracias Sole nuevamente por organizar esta actividad.
Thank you, Marcy. Hello, everyone. I'm Soledad Brizuela, Academic Coordinator at Beckett Studio, which is a language consulting firm in Buenos Aires, Argentina. First of all, I want to thank SEA, Asociación de Centros de Idiomas, for inviting us to participate in this interesting initiative. And I also want to thank you all for joining us here today. For those of you who need a certificate to evidence your participation in this webinar, we'll be sharing a link on the chat so you can fill in a form to get it. Within the framework of the theme of this initiative, Language and Culture for Diversity and Inclusion, we're presenting today this webinar on racism, classism, and why Black Lives Matter in the US. In order to gain some insight on this topic, we called a professional who has been working on helping minorities in the US have access to healthcare, and who is also an old friend, like Marcia was saying. So now let me introduce our guest speaker. Ashlei Rogers has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Baylor University and a Master of Public Health degree from Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. She has over a decade of international and domestic public health and social impact experience. As the Director of Strategic Communications She develops at Health Leads, right? She develops communication strategies, engages community activists, influencers, and fosters partnership opportunities with community-based organizations, national NGOs, foundations, and private sector companies. She's passionate about health equity and improving healthcare access to marginalized, underserved, and minority populations. She has worked on a variety of public health initiatives, which include HIV/AIDS prevention communications, family planning, sexual reproductive health education, and housing food insecurity. She has also worked for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, an institution who is very famous right now, the World Health Organization, Regions of America, and other institutions in Latin America. So thank you, Ashlei, for joining us and for being here with us today. If you're ready, you can start with your presentation now, and I'll be checking the chat in case anyone has any questions. We'll be doing that by the end of your presentation, okay?
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, or muchísimas gracias, as y'all say. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys. Marcelo and Soledad and Jonathan, I have known them for a very, very long time. When I lived in Argentina the first time, which was over 10 years ago. So I'm really excited about working with you guys. And thank you, Saya, for letting me be a part of this as well. I will go ahead and start sharing my slides. All right, are you able to see everything? Yes, I'm assuming so. You guys can hear everything, right? Perfect. All right.
Yes,
well,
actually, we can hear you.
Perfect. Well, today I'm talking about racism, classism, and why Black Lives Matter in the U.S. healthcare system. I know Black Lives Matter movement has become a global part of the global conversation about what's happening in the US in regards to African Americans and police brutality, but it goes beyond that. It also includes, you know, our healthcare, our housing, everything that's that touches systemic racism, which is a really big problem throughout the world, but especially here in the US. So I wanted to give you guys a little overview of what systemic racism is. And before I start, I do want to introduce myself as Soledad had a really great introduction for me. My name is Ashlei Rogers. I have a master's in public health. I am currently the Director of Communications of Racial and Health Equity at Health Leads. Prior to joining Health Leads, I've worked all over the world, including in Colombia and Argentina. I worked in an organization called Pro Familia, which does a lot of sexual reproductive health work. And when I was in Argentina, I worked with Beckett teaching English, but I also did some sexual reproductive health work and maternal and child health work in Rosario and Mercedes Corrientes. So I have a very fond love of Latin America, and hopefully one day I can move back. And if you're interested in learning, let me go back. If you're interested in seeing some of the other projects I'm working on, I also have a YouTube series called The Heart of Health Equity, where I interview some really compelling, interesting thought leaders who talk about racism, healthcare, and everything in between. We are just follow us on YouTube and you can see all the episodes that are coming up. We're on episode 4, that's launching next week. All right. So for systemic racism in America, you have to fully understand the history of that. So I'm going to play this video for you guys. So give me 2 seconds. Oops.
You might think racism in the US is really a case of a few bad apples. A racist cop here, a so-called Karen there, a leader of a white supremacist group. You know, people who deliberately hate. But we can't blame racism in America on just a few bad apples. Think of our nation's problem as more like an apple pie with the racial injustice baked right into every aspect of our society. Meet Ebony and Emily, 2 American babies, 1 Black, 1 white, born at the same time, same place, but Ebony will not get an equal slice of the pie, and that starts from birth. Because of her race, Ebony is 3 times more likely than Emily to die in the hospital as a newborn if her doctor is white. And once Ebony and Emily go to school, while both girls occasionally misbehave, studies show they won't face the same.
Okay, I hear that you guys can't see it, so let me see what I need to do. Can you see the screen now?
No.
Okay, let me do this again. Sorry for the technical difficulty, guys. Should be. Can you see it now?
You might think racism in the US is really a case of a few bad apples. A racist cop here, a so-called Karen there, a leader of a white supremacist group. You know, people who deliberately hate. But we can't blame racism in America on just a few bad apples. Think of our nation's problem as more like an apple pie, with the racial injustice baked right into every aspect of our society. Meet Ebony and Emily, 2 American babies, one black, one white, born at the same time, same place, but Ebony will not get an equal slice of the pie, and that starts from birth. Because of her race, Ebony is 3 times more likely than Emily to die in the hospital as a newborn if her doctor is white. And once Ebony and Emily go to school, while both girls occasionally misbehave, studies show they won't face the same punishment. Ebony is 7 times more likely than Emily to be suspended and 4 times more likely to be arrested on campus. When the 2 girls grow up and apply for jobs, odds are fewer employers will call Ebony back because she has a black-sounding name. And even though Emily and Ebony will get the same college degree, once Ebony is hired statistically as a black person, she'll make an average of 25% less than Emily. So why didn't Ebony get an equal slice of that apple pie? It's because systemic racism is built into our country's DNA. In the 17th and 18th centuries, wealthy white men needed land, so they took it from indigenous people and then forced blacks into slavery. To justify using blacks for free labor, the whites in power promoted a myth that blacks were inferior. And as Seattle-based author Ijoma Oluo points out, our nation's institutions, politics, and policies were designed against the backdrop of that money-driven lie that Black people just weren't as worthy or as capable as whites.
Our school systems were built around this. Our economic systems were built around this. Our government systems were built around this. And it is simply that things were designed to uphold this story, to uphold this exploitation.
And even though slavery ended here more than 150 years ago, the racism that fueled it persists in systemic ways today. White Americans now hold 85% of this country's wealth. Black Americans, just over 4%, and Hispanics, just over 3%. People of color, people like Ebony, are statistically more likely to be impoverished, incarcerated, and face discrimination in healthcare. Emily may have her own barriers in life, but her skin color won't be one of them.
It's not someone said, here's your wealth because you're white. Here's your status because you're white. It simply means that the barriers that we placed in front of people of color were not placed in front of you. Now, you may have a whole nother set of barriers, right? You may have barriers of disability, barriers of class, barriers of immigration status, so many other barriers that were placed in front of you. But acknowledging privilege is simply acknowledging if we also took that other set of barriers that we place in front of people of color, you would stumble even further.
So even though you may not consider yourself a bad apple, a racist cop, a so-called Karen, or a member of an extremist group, Oluo says you may have played a role. even if you have the best intentions.
Instead of this whole, let's all learn to be best friends and love each other, you can love someone of a different race and ethnicity and still actively participate in their oppression based on how you vote, based on what you bring up in your office meetings, based on where you spend your money.
It's not too late to change the recipe of the most American apple pie.
All right, I hope you guys learned a little bit from that video about some of the systemic racism issues in the United States. So I hope you guys were able to learn a little bit something about systemic racism in the United States. It's not only Black and white. Of course, the US is a melting pot of a lot of different races. Just in this example, it was mainly the story of African Americans and white Americans. But again, this also happens for those who are coming from Central and Latin America, from Asia, and other parts of Europe as well, and of course, Africa. So just kind of a little bit of a flavor of what we're dealing with here currently and why things are bubbling up to the top. But I do want to give you guys some additional insight into the history of the US and our healthcare system. So give me 2 seconds. Let me share my screen again. All right, so today racism is still a problem in the American healthcare system, as you saw in that video. To give you a little history about why there's currently a lot of distrust with the medical and medical institutions with African Americans, you have to understand that for centuries, there was a lot of experiments done on us that were with no consent. So because the US is known for 400 years of slavery, I personally am a descendant of slaves. My great-great-grandfather was a slave, and my parents ironically picked cotton in the 50s and 60s. So this is not that far removed from, African Americans feeling the pain of not being equal to white Americans, and also doing some of the grunt work that's being done for picking cotton, to working really hard on the railroads, to taking care of other people's children without being paid. So I'm not sure if any of you guys are part of the medical field, but this guy, Dr. J. Marone Sims, he is considered the father of gynecology. In the 1800s, he did a lot of horrible surgeries on Black women and experiments on Black women. The women, we only know about 3 women, but there were many more. Their names were Lucy, Archna, and Betsy. Archna actually had 30 surgeries performed on her, and none of them had anesthesia, meaning they had no pain medication. He did some of these for medical reasons. Other times he did it for fun. He was able to document all of the research that he had, and because of that, he made a lot of money and he got a lot of acclaim. But he did a lot of harm to Black women. Later on, he was able to use what he learned in the experiments on Black women and Black slaves to help other white women, but this time he used anesthesia. And he continued to not use anesthesia for Black women, although it was available. Later on, 100 years later, there was a lot of protests in the 70s and 80s and also 90s, saying that he shouldn't have a statue, and people shouldn't say he was the greatest doctor of gynecology and he was amazing because he did a lot of harm for Black women. So in 2018, his statue was finally removed from Central Park, which is a really large park in New York City. And it was relocated to his gravesite in Brooklyn, New York, with less acclaim. And I also believe his plaque now has the real history of what he's done to Black women, and particularly the Black slaves. Today, now Black women have the highest maternal mortality rates. So even though he did a lot of experiments on us, it did not help us in regards to our health. We also we also still receive less pain medication for various issues like broken bones and cancer. Children also receive less pain medication compared to their white counterparts because there is a lot of, I guess, myths out there saying that Black people have thicker skin, that we don't experience pain at the same level. And because of that, we do not receive the same level of care from the healthcare system. And this has been happening for hundreds of years. And especially now it's becoming a problem because Black people do not trust the healthcare system at all. And we go only when we have to, and sometimes it's too late to receive adequate care. Even though slavery was finished in the US, we had the Jim Crow laws. So as soon as they freed the slaves, the US government implemented rules and laws that that Black people were not equal, and we had to be segregated or separated from other groups. Jim Crow laws ended during my parents' time, so they also weren't allowed to eat at restaurants, or if they were, they had to sit out back where only Black people were allowed. They were also not allowed to sit in the front of the bus. They always had to go to the back of the bus. There have been a lot of lynchings with the Ku Klux Klan. If a Black man looked at a white woman, for example, he could be killed for that. Black people were constantly being accosted by police then, and as we are now. So there are a lot of issues with Jim Crow laws, and the Jim Crow laws made it legal for Black people to be abused in the system, or not be able to have the same rights. And Jim Crow laws were not, if you notice there's a picture at the bottom, Jim Crow laws were not only towards Black people, it was also other people of color. So those who spoke Spanish or were of Mexican descent, they also did not have the same level of treatment and weren't able to access the same things as white people. I also want to show another study just to kind of give you an idea of how far it goes back in terms of treatment of Black people in the medical system. I'm not sure if any of you guys have heard about the Tuskegee study of syphilis. Syphilis is actually a sexually transmitted infection that is treatable now. You can get it, if you get it, you can go to the doctor and get some medication for it and you're fine. But the issue is that if you let it go on too long, you can have severe health issues. You can pass it on to a woman who she may not know she has it, and she can have a stillborn birth, meaning that she'll have a child that will be delivered, but it will be dead from the syphilis taking over while she was pregnant. So for Tuskegee study, it was a 40-year human experiment, and basically the US government decided to do an experiment on Black men who tested positive for syphilis, and instead of treating them with penicillin, which was a medication that could cure it, they decided to wait and see how bad it would get if they did not treat them. So they pretended like they were giving the medication for syphilis, but they were not. This happened, this is a timeline. So in 1932, the US Public Health Service engaged the Tuskegee Institute in Macomb, Alabama, which is in the southern part of the United States, in the Tuskegee syphilis study. In the mid-1940s, penicillin became the treatment of choice for syphilis, but men in study were not treated. And in 1972, a whistleblower, which is a person that sees something going wrong at a company or on a study or whatever, and they tell important people so they can make sure that it's nationally known that bad things are happening. So Peter Buxton leaked the story to the New York Times, and it made front page news. It was only until then that the Tuskegee study finally ended. And in 1974, the participants sued the US government for $10 million. And then not until 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology. But the story is still talked about among Black communities, and the numbers are staggering. Let me see. When the study started, there were 600 Black men that were enrolled. And by the time the study ended, over 140 of them had died. 19 of their children had acquired congenital syphilis, and they probably died as well. And 40 of their wives had also been infected. So you can see that this is it's a story that wasn't that long ago. And And like the last person that was part of the study died in 2004. So only 15 years ago, we still had a person here who was part of the study living and breathing. And for Black people, this is one of the reasons why we're afraid of joining research studies. We're also fearful of like the COVID-19 vaccine. I personally have been fully vaccinated, and so is my family, but a lot of Black people in the US still have not, because they do not trust the system based on studies like this. I have another one, which is a very famous case, Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was a 31-year-old wife and mother who was diagnosed with cervical cancer. She went to Johns Hopkins Medicine, which is part of Johns Hopkins University, to receive care. And while she went there specifically because Black people at the time were not allowed to enter a lot of hospitals. And this was one of the very few that treated Black people. While she was there, Dr. George Otto Gray took some of her cells without her consent and decided to do some research on the cells. Henrietta Lacks actually ended up dying from cervical cancer, but her cells lived on. So we're saying what happened next. So for 20 years, her children and her family members had no idea that her cells were taken to be used for experiments. They didn't know until a medical reporter, Rebecca Slooks, who's this woman at the far left end, started doing research for a book. And that's when they realized, oh my gosh, we didn't know that Johns Hopkins University and Johns Hopkins Medical Institution took the cells, which are now used in mostly all types of medical research. The family was never compensated. And the cells are specifically called the HeLa cells. And they're used for all forms of medical research. Thus far, they have been used for 100,000 scientific publications. And they range in topics of cancer, cell biology, genetics, and infectious diseases such as COVID-19. So when they were doing research to find a vaccine for COVID-19, they were using this woman's cells. So because this woman's cells have been used all over, a lot of medical companies have made millions and billions of dollars off of her cells that were taken from her without her consent, without her knowing, without her family knowing. And it wasn't until this woman wrote this book that people started paying attention and realizing what was happening. And for Black people, we are questioning how many more Henrietta Lacks exist. We're sure that her story is not the only. There are multiple people's stories where they've taken our DNA and used it or exploited it and have not told the families, or have not have compensated us or given us money for using our genetic information. This is the last case study that I have for you guys. His name is DeMonte Driver. And this is just kind of to tell you a little bit about classism in the US. So yes, the US is a very, very rich country. We have a lot of medical advances, but regardless of your race, if you are poor or an immigrant who doesn't have the same, if I guess it's like if you're poor, if you don't have housing, if you have a lot of, if you're not one of the ones who are highly educated and rich or have access to certain levels of healthcare, you could die from the most common fixable issues. So for DeMonte Driver, he had a really bad toothache. And because his mother was really, really poor, he wasn't able to go to a dentist and say, hey, like I have a toothache, can you pull my tooth or can you give me some medication? He ended up going to the hospital because it got so bad. And the hospital was also like, look, you don't have health insurance. We really can't do much, but we'll go ahead and give you some aspirin or Tylenol, some little pain medication to take care of it, and off you go. So then his mom went back home, but DeMonte was still in a lot of pain. So a week later, the mom went back to the hospital saying, look, like, can you please help my son? Like, it's really bad. He's really, really sick, and his tooth hurts really, really bad. They were again like, you don't have good health insurance. I'm so sorry. We can't take you. You have no health insurance, actually. we can't take you, but here's something else. Here's to patch it up. Later on in the week, that toothache got so bad that the infection went to his brain and he went into a coma. At that time, that's when the hospital decided to work on him. The medical treatment cost over $250,000 to treat him. But had they actually addressed him the first time when he was really sick with a toothache, it would have cost $80 for someone to pull the tooth, but they chose not to because he didn't have health insurance. And this happens in the US a lot. Some of the most healthiest people are dying because they do not have access to health insurance or access to care. And it's really unfortunate. It's very sad. And that's why I do the work I do, to one, educate people about public health issues, but also to provide access to healthcare to the most marginalized and underserved people of all walks of life and all races, because this is a really big issue. And it's happened only 13 years ago, 14 years ago. And this is happening now, even now with COVID. There's some people who aren't able to access the hospitals because one, now our hospitals are very full, but also two, because they're afraid of having the medical bill, because if you don't have health insurance, it's very, very expensive to get care here. And so, yeah, it's a problem. And so I just kind of wanted to give you guys a little bit of insight into what's happening in the Black community and why there's a lot of distrust. And so the long-term effects for the Black community is we don't trust the system. We also don't have the same level of access to care. When we do go to the hospital, sometimes we're dismissed because of racism. And it's just a long battle. And this is why COVID has disproportionately impacted minority communities. And this is not just African Americans, but also Latinos, Native Americans. And so the summer 2020 kind of opened the eyes for everybody. Here's for the COVID pandemic. This is from 2020. You can see that African Americans were disproportionately impacted by COVID, next with Native Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and then whites. I personally have been impacted by COVID as well. Both of my parents contracted it in the summer of 2020. My dad ended up dying from it in November of 2020 before the vaccines were available. And I know to date, 25 people who have died from COVID. Most of them are people of color, so they're Hispanic and Black. A handful of people who are older and who are white, but a lot of them are minorities. And so it's a problem just because we don't have access to care. So those who had issues like diabetes, hypertension, obesity problems, a lot of times it was happening among minority communities because they lived in areas that did not have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, or have access to safe walking areas to work out, or even access to affordable housing, which is also a problem as well. So the US, because of the systemic racism issues, it has trickled down into all forms of healthcare, but also all forms of regular day life. And now we're seeing it kind of explode with COVID-19, and this is why our cases are so high. Currently, although we have a lot of vaccines available for people, because there isn't trust in the system, because of all the shady things that have happened in the past, a lot of people even now do not want to take the vaccine, even though here, a lot of the people who are currently dying of COVID are the unvaccinated. So it's really unfortunate because I know there are a lot of countries that are begging for vaccines, and here we have not too many, but we have enough for everyone, and not everyone is taking it. So it's a really big problem. And our hospitals are getting full to capacity, where if you have a normal ailment, like if you had a toothache, you couldn't go to the hospital right now. They wouldn't treat you because there's not any room. So a lot of people now there's issues with people who are dying, not from COVID, but from other diseases, because they can't get into our hospitals because now they are too full. In certain states like Texas, where I am currently, Florida, Alaska, we're almost at the brink of not being allowed to have other people into the hospitals, which is a really big problem. And finally, I know you guys joined this call because you were interested in the Black Lives Matter movement. Last summer, although Black men and Black people have been killed by police for generations, hundreds of years, the video of George Floyd being killed for over nine minutes struck a chord with a lot of people, not only in the US, but also around the world. And so now more people are actually taking note of what's happening to Black Americans, but Black people all over the world in regards to police brutality in our healthcare system. And I wanted to show another video of why here in the US people were protesting. It's a little rough, but I think it's important for us to have this conversation to see what's really happening in America. Hold on just a second. And this is just a depiction of why people are protesting. And this was the summer of 2020 when this was recorded. And the guy who's speaking, he has a PhD and he's brilliant. He talks a lot of things about race, but he's also very candid about what's happening in the US around it.
So we rebel so you can feel our pain. We rebel so you can understand that enough is enough. We tried sitting in, we tried chanting, we tried singing, we tried rapping, we tried hashtags, we ran marathons so you listen to us, and you don't listen until you feel some of this pain. On Monday, May 25th, George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police. He was unarmed and he wasn't resisting arrest. Ever since that moment, the city has been up in arms. There have been protests that have gotten more and more intense over the days. The most recent protests have been so intense that a Target caught on fire, that things were destroyed, and the media and citizens are saying, why are these people rioting? So I'm going to tell you why. First of all, these are not riots. Riots are irrational, they're random, they're just brutal acts of violence with no rhyme or reason, with no purpose. These are rebellions. Rebellions are organized acts of resistance against an unjust system. What's happening in Minneapolis is no different than what happened in Detroit in 1967, what happened in LA in 1992, what happened in Ferguson in 2014. What's happening is people who have finally said, we have had enough and we are going to do something about it. People say, well, why now? Because we're tired. Black death happens every day. If Black folk rebelled every time something happened that should not happen, we'd be rebelling all day. But we don't do that. But there comes a point where you've had enough. And right now we're at a moment where we can't turn on the television, we can't go to social media without seeing somebody who looks like us put down like a dog, killed by the state, killed by random white citizens, just because we're committing the crime of being Black and outside. We're tired of it. We're tired of being one phone call away from a disgruntled white woman with an unleashed dog from being sent to a lynching. We're tired. We're tired. And the problem is, y'all don't listen until we do something. Martin Luther King said, the riot is the language of the unheard. Well, these rebellions are the language of the unheard. This system does not listen to Black death. Black death is ordinary. Black death is common. No other race is on the news or on social media getting killed day after day after day without any warning. Only Black folk. So the reason why we have to do this is to get the nation's attention. And how do you get the nation's attention? By damaging their property and by making them feel as unsafe as we feel every single day. Now, that's not to say we should go around killing people. That's not to say we should just burn stuff up just to burn it down. But every once in a while, we have to make our voices heard. We have to make our pain known. And sometimes that means stopping a cog in the wheel of capitalism. Sometimes that means shutting down a Target. Sometimes that means stopping the status quo. When people say, oh my God, they're looting, they're stealing. That's the same outrage we feel by exploitative business. That's the same outrage we feel when a government is willing to open up the country as soon as they realize there's only Black folk dying. The same unsafety and vulnerability that y'all are feeling right now, we feel every day. So we rebel so you can feel our pain. We rebel so you can understand that enough is enough. We tried sitting in, we tried chanting, we tried singing, we tried rapping, we tried hashtags, we ran marathons so you listen to us, and you don't listen until you feel some of this pain. People are saying, well, you're destroying your own neighborhood. Look how irrational these people are. Again, stop framing Black people as irrational. We're not destroying our own neighborhoods. That Target might be in the hood, but we don't own it. Those businesses might be in our neighborhoods, but we don't have a financial stake in it. The truth is, our neighborhoods have been occupied and colonized since we've been here. So when we are pushing back and burning stuff down, and when we are destroying things, it's not because we don't have a plan. It's because y'all haven't listened to plan A or plan B or plan C or plan D. So by the time we get to this stage, this is all we have left. So if you want there not to be rebellions, if you don't want to see these cities on fire, then listen to us when we tell you we're in pain. Listen to us when we tell you we're vulnerable. Listen to us when we tell you we're unsafe. Listen to us when we tell you, America, you've got to do something different, because if you don't, everybody's going to experience what it's like to be in America.
All right, so I know that video was it was really intense, but I think it kind of gives you an idea of what was happening, especially in the summer of 2020 among African Americans and around the world as well. The US we're always improving. You know, we have, you know, once you can address an issue, then you can solve it for it. But until then, we have to talk about it. And so I think now people are finally having honest, candid conversations about race and what that means for communities of color. And I say communities of color, it's not just Black people. It's those from Latin America, it's those from Asian descent, it's those from Native American or Native populations. We've all have our story, and people are finally listening to us so we can address the bigger problems. Because for a long time, when we were saying, hey, the system isn't fair to us, or hey, like, we're experiencing a lot more pain because of all these things, we were constantly being dismissed or told, oh, it's in your head, like, it's not that big of a deal, that's not really happening. Oh, it was one time a Black man was beat up by police. You're like, nope, it was the one time you saw it on camera, but it's happened many, many times. And so this is happening in healthcare as well. There are many people who are not getting the adequate care they need and are dying. And they're dying, and they're experiencing a lot of pain, and it's really sad. And so hopefully with Health Leads and with the work that I'm doing and the work that you guys are hopefully doing, we're all making a change to be better and to do better in the world. And yeah, I'm thankful for talks like this, so we can kind of shed light on what's happening in the world outside of what you usually see in the US. So I just want to share this one last slide with you guys, and then I will open the floor for questions. So again, to finalize what we're saying, like, Black lives do matter. These are just a handful of the names that have been killed by police or have had issues happening in the medical institutions, that we just want to make sure we're highlighting them and, you know, giving the respect that's due. So yeah, say their names, remember that, like, there are many stories that we don't know and many faces that we don't know, but it's happening all the time. So thank you. And I've tried to put my LinkedIn information, but you can find me on LinkedIn at Ashlei Rogers. Please add me. I would love to stay in touch with you guys. Also, you can check out my show and get some updates on what's happening around health equity. Any questions?
Wow, Ashlei. Yeah, there are some questions. I'm going to share with you. This is really impressive, sickening and heartbreaking information that you've been sharing. I know we see a lot of information like this all the time, but when we are talking about this, and especially after all the things we've been discussing this week, it's really impressive. I'm going to share first some questions they are asking here. Let me see. Someone is asking, how does healthcare work today? What happened with Obama healthcare?
Okay, so Obama.
Right? It was Obama.
Yeah, so Obama's, they call it Obamacare, but in reality, it's called the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act is something that was really amazing. It was our hope, like, as public health people, like, oh, it's getting closer to universal healthcare like you guys have in Argentina. I know you can have private healthcare, but also if you're sick and you don't have a lot of money, you can still go to the hospital. The Affordable Care Act was trying to bridge that gap. Some states did not pick it up. So the states that are really struggling right now with COVID, they didn't want to expand their Medicaid, which is another form of government assistance for healthcare. Because of that, some people are still not able to get affordable medical treatment because certain states, and I'll say mainly conservative states, did not want to. Like, a lot of the states, so what am I going to say? The states in the US, in the South, where I am, like, there's Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, they're actually doing the worst, in Florida, they're doing the worst in regards to COVID. is because the healthcare is so poor, and the Affordable Care Act wasn't rolled out the same as it was in like a state like California or a state like Massachusetts, because they had governors that believed in the Affordable Care Act, believed in Obama's vision, and the conservative states did not. So because of that, the citizens of those states are suffering. And we're really suffering now because of COVID. So yes, we have Affordable Care Act. It's not accessible for everyone. Sometimes it's gotten a lot more expensive for certain, for like, if you're in certain states, it costs different than other states, but it's also, it's not as easy to get as it could be because certain states don't want to bring it into the system, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I have a question connected to that. What was your experience like when you came to Latin America and particularly in Argentina, when you worked in initiatives connected with public health? What was your experience like in terms of public health and healthcare?
So I love, you know how much I love Argentina. Like that is like where I want to live, I want to retire, all the things. But I learned a lot because one, I didn't experience racism in Argentina. Like I personally felt treated better as a Black person in Argentina than I do in the US. But I think it's because they're not, at the time when I first moved there weren't a lot of Black people. Now I know you guys have a lot of Colombians and people from other countries that are there. So that was a nice experience. With that said, I did realize that there is racism against Bolivians, Paraguayans, Peruvians. And so it's everywhere, right? So like they don't have the same level of care. And so when I was going to these public health institutions, I noticed that they weren't the blonde or blue-eyed Argentines that were in these systems. It was usually the ones who looked more indigenous, the ones who were, you know, from Bolivian, Paraguayan descent that were accessing the free healthcare. And I thought that was really interesting for me. I learned a lot. I got really, really sick when I first moved to, like really sick. And I was so afraid because I didn't have health insurance in Argentina. I was so afraid to go to an actual doctor that I went to, was it Almaty? It was one of the public hospitals. And I got there at like 4 a.m. to get my ticket to like stand in line and then finally see a doctor. And I was so thankful that I didn't have a bill. I was mind blown, like, whoa, like I don't have to pay anything. This is great. But I also was really sad that the US doesn't have the same type of option. Because here, like, if you don't have insurance, it's kind of like good luck, you most likely will die. Like, it's really sad. Like, it's a really big problem. And yes, we do have some social services available, but they're not enough for as many people who don't have access to healthcare. So it just gets worse and worse and worse. Or if you have, there are many stories where people will have cancer, but they had signs of cancer. Let's say 5 years ago, they had a sign of cancer, but because they were afraid to go to the doctor because they couldn't afford it, they let it get worse and worse and worse. And then finally they're stage 4 now and it's too late. And it happens when all types of health issues. So in Argentina specifically, I was thankful that there was free healthcare because I'm sure more people survive there. And even though you have to wait and like sometimes there's cats in the lobbies and all that stuff, you still get the care. In the US, you may not get the care at all, depending on what's going on and your insurance situation, sadly.
There are some comments here. So sad to hear stories like this again and again for the umpteenth time, and nothing is being done to find a way out. Here, there you go, Mr. Hill is right. What else is needed to work this out? With wide eyes open, we need to scheme a new plan for the whole planet. What are the most recent changes in the US law system in favor of minorities that you are aware of?
The law system for laws?
Mm-hmm.
Well, right now, unfortunately, with Trump, when Trump was in office, he stripped a lot of those laws away. And we're slowly learning about all the ones that he was doing in terms of immigration status and voters' rights. A lot of those are being taken away. So now I feel like the administration is just trying to correct some of those issues because Trump did a lot of damage. And like, obviously I'm not a big supporter of him, and maybe some people in this call are, but he did a lot of damage in regards to healthcare and racial issues in the US. Yes, racism was always a thing, but when he came in office, he kind of gave those who had negative views of people of color a platform. And now they feel like they can do and say anything, which is part of the reason why I think summer 2020 happened, because people were just done. So yes, laws are being made. We're, as public health people, as people in the medical institutions, we're constantly trying to fight the good fight and change things, but it's little by little. Not everything happens overnight. But I think as more people are becoming aware of the issues, that's when more change will happen. But I think a long time people thought, oh, things are fine. Like, we have a Black president now when Obama was in office. So like, we're good. Like, Black people have the same rights now, But obviously that wasn't the case, So we're working on it. I mean, I don't want to leave this conversation saying the US is horrible, because it's not. Like, we have a lot of good things, but in regards to healthcare, we have a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. And I was especially impressed, and I'm really interested in asking you about this, by something they mentioned in one of the, I think it was the first video, that we may be playing a role in it, even if we have the best intentions.
Yep.
So what can we do to become aware of those behaviors that we may have that make people feel discriminated? What do you think we can do?
Oh, that's a good question. I think being aware of your privilege is important, right? All of us have privilege. Like, I, as a Black woman, yes, I deal with racism in the US, but I am highly educated. I'm a part of a certain economic standpoint. I can travel the world. I can do all these different things. So because of that, I know that when I walk into spaces, I may be treated differently than another Black person that may be lower income, right? Being aware of that and knowing how that person's being treated, and calling out when you see someone say something negative about another person of color or another person of a different economic standpoint. I know, and I'm just saying from experience in Argentina, I know even though there weren't that many Black people, the term like negro was used around that was very derogatory towards someone who was maybe like moreno or something. And those little jabs, those are things that you're continuing the racist tendencies, because that's not okay, right? Like, so, or when you see someone
the language
is important. Also, I know that just from me observing that people who are working in corporate offices, a lot of times you don't see a lot of people from other countries. Like, you don't see them from like Peru or Bolivia working in these offices, or if they are the secretary, or they are the person cleaning the bathrooms or whatever. Like, no, why? There are a lot of them who are going to college, like, why can't you hire the ones who are, who have the same credentials, but are of a different race or a different nationality? And I think when you start realizing, like, looking around and seeing everyone that looks like you can do better by like giving opportunities to those who don't always have a chance. And like, I've gotten to where I am now because there are a few people who, kept the door open, or like, let me in when there are not that many people who look like me in spaces. So I'm thankful for that, but there's more work to do. And I think in the US, in Argentina specifically, there's more to do in those spaces,
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
And here's another question connected to what you're doing right now in your role at Health Leads. What are the projects you're working on at the moment in Health Leads?
Oh, sure. So I'm working on several projects. I'm working on housing insecurity, meaning that there's a lot of issues with homelessness. And it's a national organization. So homelessness is a really big problem in California. And so we're trying to provide more access to affordable housing, because there's certain, like when I lived in LA, I had a 1-bedroom apartment that cost $2,000 a month. That was like the average cost for an apartment. And that's insane if you only make $10 an hour. So they're trying to make it so that people who make minimum wage jobs can afford housing and are not being kicked out. With COVID, when people weren't able to work, we had some laws in place to prevent people from losing their homes, but those have now been, they're now done. It happened, like, I think last month. So now those people are in fear of being evicted. And so we're trying to work hard to try to figure out other alternatives for them to be able to get another type of housing or be able to stay in their current home. Working on that. I'm also working on maternal and child health issues in New York, where we're trying to make sure that, pregnant women have access to not only doctors and nurses, but also doulas, and midwives, and then also have access to fruits and vegetables, because I know in Argentina, it's more expensive to go to McDonald's than it is to go to the fruit stand and buy fruits and vegetables. Here in the US, it's the opposite. To buy fresh fruits and vegetables is really expensive. Going to McDonald's, it's $1 a sandwich, or for fries or whatever. So it's much cheaper to eat fast food than it is to eat healthy. And that's a problem. So we're trying to change that as well, to have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, but affordable fresh fruits and vegetables for everyone.
Wow. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think there are no more questions. Thank you so much. It's really been so interesting to hear all this, to see all this, and to get your input from your experience, right? So thank you so much, Ashley, for joining us today. And well, thank you all the ones who were here with us today. Please don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel of SEA, Asociación de Centros de Idiomas, and well, we'll be having more activities during this Semana de los Idiomas. You can find a link over there to check out all the activities. And well, this is it. Thank you so much. I don't know if Fabio wants to say something, but thank you, Ash.
No, thank you guys. I really appreciate it. This was fun. If you guys have any other questions, find me on LinkedIn. More than happy to help.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Sole. Gracias a todos que nos acompañaron en esta actividad en el marco de la Semana de los Idiomas. Como dijo Sole, los invitamos a acompañarnos en las próximas actividades, hoy y mañana, y a ver las actividades que ya pasaron en nuestro canal de YouTube también. Próximamente van a estar subidas otras actividades que se realizaron por otras plataformas, por Zoom, y entonces ahí van a poder ver todas las actividades y la agenda completa. Bueno, muchas gracias. Thank you, Ashley, again. Y bueno, nos vemos en los próximos eventos, en las próximas actividades. Nos vemos en la Semana de los Idiomas. Seguimos.
Chao.
Bye.
Chao.